Hey everyone, I'm Jeff. Welcome to the Stables Wine Tasting Night. I'm sure some of you are really eager to get into your wines. So if you've got your wines, you're ready to go. We're going to start off with our Pinot Grigio, and then we're going to move on to our Pinot Gris. So I'm actually the winemaker for Trackless Vineyard. We are a small vineyard based down in Barrel in the Southern Highlands. We run our vineyard all biodynamically, and then we run sheep through the vineyard for the entire growing season. So we're quite a sustainable label. And what this means is because of the sheep, we're using our tractor about 60% less. And that's where the name Trackless comes from. So let's get into some wines though, because that's why we're here. As I said, we're kicking off with the Pinot Grigio. Everyone comes into our cellar door all the time asking me, what's the difference between Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio? And so we decided we're going to make the difference. And Grigio, which is the one we're tasting first, this is the Italian way of making it, and Gris is the French way of making it. And the first big difference we actually see between the two is actually the philosophy behind the winemaking. If you think about Italian winemakers, it's all about the food. And so food is really important to them when they're making their wine. It's something they're always thinking of. And to an extent, we can say an Italian winemaker is making a wine specifically for a food. It's not exactly 100% true, but they are definitely very conscious of food when they're making wine. The French, on the other hand, the wine is all about the wine. It doesn't mean that they match any less with food, because the French Gris match beautifully with food. It just means that they're approaching the winemaking from these, I guess, two different ends of the spectrum. So we end up with these two really different styles. Think about Italy. A lot of seed food, maritime climate, a little bit warmer down there. So the Italians, they're trying to create something really fresh and zippy and crisp and steely. So when I'm making the Grigio, the first thing I do is I actually harvest it nice and early. And I'm harvesting it at what we call a Baumé level of about 11 to 12 Baumé. Now, this is a sugar level. There's a million different ways to measure sugar. There's like Oeschlers and Brixes and grams per litre and specific gravities. Look, a lot of winemakers, we like to use Baumé, because if I take one Baumé of sugar and I convert it into alcohol with a yeast, I end up with 1% alcohol. So it's just a really easy 1-for-1 ratio. So we're harvesting these grapes at about 11 to 12 Baumé, which means they end up being about 11 to 12% alcohol. So it's one of the first big differences. That's slightly earlier, slightly lower alcohol than I guess we're used to for a lot of our white wines. The next thing I do, Italians, not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I actually squeeze off all the juice into a tank, and then I'll fill a bucket from the bottom of the tank, and I'll tip it in the top, and I'll fill it from the bottom, and I'll tip it in the top. And I might do this 10, 20 times until all of that juice goes brown from the oxygen. And then I do a nice, cold, long, slow ferment. And that oxygen and that cold, slow ferment helps me do a couple of things with the Grigio. The first thing, it helps me stabilize some of the flavors in the wine. The next thing is it helps me create what we call a steely palate. And Italian Grigios are really famous for this steely palate. And what do I mean by steely palate? Well, have a look around the restaurant, find yourself a little bit of stainless steel, maybe your fork or your spoon or something, and give it a lick. And this is what I mean by a steely palate. It's kind of like a metallic-y feeling, but it's quite a clean, crisp, metallic-y feeling. And the Italian Grigios are really famous for this, I guess, textual note in their Grigios. One of the things that I find really difficult with Italian Grigios, and I actually find it with a lot of Italian wines, really hard to taste in a wine tasting or a scenario where you don't really have that much time or that much food. And that's because there's a lot of hidden flavors in these wines. Now, I mentioned how we make it with that cold ferment. That stabilizes these flavors. And if you were to take that Grigio and sit it on your table for the rest of the evening, taste it with like different foods, taste it at different temperatures, what you'll find is it really changes quite a lot. And every time you look at it, oh, you'll see another flavor, oh, and another flavor and another flavor. And this is one of the things that's really difficult with Italian styles of wine is because they really need that time and that food to show you everything they have to offer. And then when the final thing, when you taste it, nice, crisp, clean, zippy, that nice steely palate. And you get that sort of fresh apples and fresh pears, but you don't see any yeasty, cheesy characters. And one of my favorite matches with the Pinot Grigio is actually fresh oysters. And when you match it with fresh oysters, you all of a sudden get these beautiful yeasty, cheesy flavors coming out of the wine. You think, where did that come from? Because I can't taste it in the wine now, but then I match it with an oyster and I get these beautiful yeasty, cheesy characters. And it's a really good example of what these Pinot Grigios do. What we might do now is jump over to our Pinot Gris. So that one was Grigio. That's the Italian way of making it. Grigio, Italians, they harvest it early. They ferment it cold and they use a lot of oxygen in their ferment, and they're trying to create something really zippy and crisp and fresh. The French, on the other hand, well, if you think about France, the wine is all about the wine. And most of the Pinot Gris in France is grown up in Alsace, which is on the French-German border. So it's quite a cold region. So the French, they're trying to create something that's big and round and voluptuous. So the first thing I do when I'm making this French style is I actually let it ripen another probably about 3 or 4 weeks until that Beaumet level is about 13 to 14. So we end up with about 13 to 14% alcohol in the Pinot Gris. And the first thing you'll notice, and you'll probably see it a lot better in your glass than mine, is that color difference. It's got a real sort of bronzy color, almost a pinky tinge to it. And that's because of that extra ripeness level. And Pinot Gris is a really interesting white grape variety. It's actually one of the only white grapes in the world that when it gets really ripe, it actually starts turning red. So when our sugar levels in the Pinot Gris get to sort of high 12s, early 13s, the skins on the berries actually start turning pink. And this is where their name comes from, because when you have all these little pink berries hanging in a bunch, and that bunch is hanging in the distance in the vineyard, from a distance, the bunches actually look grey. And the French word for grey is gris. So Pinot, because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and Gris because the bunches look grey on the grapevines. And so that's the first big difference we see between Grigio and Gris, is that colour difference. The next thing, if you look really carefully at your glass, and you can give it a bit of a swirl, but you see about here, there's this rim of clear liquid on your glass, and it's dribbling back down into the wine. Now we call this the legs of the wine. And what that is everything volatile. So anything in that wine that can evaporate out at room temperature, it evaporates out. It condensates on the glass around here, and then it dribbles back down into the wine. Now this is predominantly alcohol. So the reason we don't see those legs as much in the Grigio is because it's only 11, 12%. The Gris, 13, 14%. So we see these legs. And this alcohol actually does something really interesting to the wine. If you get your glass and give it a good swirl and have a big smell, you'll probably agree with me that the Pinot Gris, it seems to be a lot more aromatic. There's a lot of fruit flavor jumping out of that glass. The interesting thing is, if I was to scientifically analyze the aromatic compounds of the Pinot Gris and the aromatic compounds of the Pinot Grigio, the Grigio's actually got loads more. And that's what's happening is, as that alcohol is evaporating out of that glass of wine, it's grabbing onto all the other flavor compounds with it and pulling it out. So when we smell it, we get hit with all those flavors all at once. And this is one of the really big differences between Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris is kind of like, hey, look at me, this is everything I have to offer. Whereas Pinot Grigio is really shy. It'll show you a couple of flavors. Once a change in temperature, it'll show another couple of flavors. Once a change in food, and it'll show you another couple of flavors. So the way these two wines actually show you their flavors is one of the really big differences between the styles. If you were to take that Pinot Gris and sit it on your table for the rest of the evening, taste it with different foods, taste it at different temperatures, it really wouldn't change that much. What you see is what you get. And then we taste the Pinot Gris. It's big, it's round, it's voluptuous. And one of the key things we're looking for in a Pinot Gris, it kind of has this viscosity, like this oily viscosity to it. And that's what we call a glycerol. And when we're making Pinot Gris, we ferment it at a much warmer temperature so it can create these beautiful glycerols in the mouth and give us a bit more of that sort of viscousy mouthfeel. And this is one of the challenges we always have as a winemaker, because if I'm doing a really nice cold ferment, I get high aromatic compounds, but not many mouthfeel compounds. If I do a really warm ferment, I get lots of mouthfeel compounds, but not many aromatic compounds. So we're normally finding this balance, aromatics, mouthfeel, aromatics, mouthfeel, aromatics, mouthfeel. With Gris and Grigios, it's easy. We've just created two different styles. We've got the Italian style, which is all about that aromatics and less about mouthfeel. And then we've got the French style, which is all about mouthfeel and less about aromatics. But we can't have a wine without both of them. So the Italians, to try and build up that mouthfeel, what they do is they leave the dead yeast in the wine after the ferment, and we mix it and mix it and mix it. And the French call this batonnage. And what happens is that dead yeast breaks down and it imparts more of a savory, yeasty, cheesy character to the wine, but also gives you a bit of textural mouthfeel. The French, or what they do to try and trap in that aromatic compounds, which they're losing with the warm ferment, is they do everything under carbon dioxide cover. So even if I'm transferring from one tank to a next or into a barrel, whatever I'm doing, I never let this wine touch oxygen. So we fill the barrel with carbon dioxide, we fill the tank with carbon dioxide, and we transfer it. And that way we're holding in as many aromatics as we can. So we end up with these two really completely different styles. Now, these two wines are from the exact same vineyard, the exact same block. The only difference is about 3-4 weeks harvest and the winemaking techniques. And it's a really great example of what the winemaker and the viticulturist can do to the final wine, because they are completely different wines, but from the same grape. So I love showing those two. One of the challenges for us here in Australia is there's no definition for Gris or Grigios. So it can be a bit of a lucky dip when you go into a bottle shop or a restaurant, because a Grigio could be a Gris could be a Grigio. Probably 9 times out of 10, I find that I call it, I guess, an Australian Gris or an Australian Grigio. It's kind of a complex Grigio or a more fresh Gris, and it sits at around about that 12.5. It probably uses a little bit more French techniques, but on a earlier ripening grape. And so around about that 12.5 Beaumont. And so we end up with a fresher style of a Pinot Gris, but it makes it really difficult for us in Australia to really work out what style we're going to get. It's starting to change a little bit. 5 years ago, if I entered a wine in a wine show, I would enter it as a wine made from a Pinot Gris grape. If I enter in a wine show now, I actually enter it as a Grigio or a Gris. And if I was to put that Grigio, for example, in a Pinot Gris class, even though it's a beautiful Grigio, it's probably a gold level Grigio, it wouldn't get any marks because it's not a Gris. And so this is starting to change. We're seeing it in the wine shows now, and over the next sort of 5 or 10 years, we'll see that filter down, and eventually we'll probably see it, if not in labeling law, in definitely some sort of marking on the bottle or labels in the future. So that's our Gris and Grigios. Given that it's going to be cold, no doubt, up there, and as you can see, I'm in our little cellar door here in Bowral, and I've still got my jacket on, so it's already cold. And I've heard what are we now? I'm recording this in early June, and you've already had about a metre up there, so perfect. I figured we'll do a few more reds and whites tonight. So the first red we're going to look at is our Nebbiolo. Now, Nebbiolo, it's an Italian variety. A lot of you may have drunk it and not knowing you were drinking it. And one of the, I guess, challenges between Europe and Australia is that the Europeans name everything after a region, but we name everything after a grape variety. So if you were drinking a Barolo in Italy, a Barolo is made from Nebbiolo grapes. And so in Australia, we name it after the variety. I love it as a variety. It's, you know, I guess Shiraz, Cabernet, these varieties that we see a lot in Australia are quite fruit driven. You know, we're always talking about raspberries and blueberries and blackberries and cassis and these sort of fruity characters. Whereas Nebbiolo, they traditionally describe it as rose and tar. And I think it's a really great description because it's in a more savory spectrum. You know, when you smell it, you can definitely see those red fruits in there, those red floral sort of characters, but it's got this nice licoricey, earthy charriness about it. I guess I get this beautiful texture to the finish with Nebbiolo as well. A little bit, I don't know if you've tried many Spanish wines like Rioja and Tempranillos and things. They do like these nice, like minerality to the palate. And I find I get that quite a lot in Nebbiolo. It's kind of like, and I promise I don't make a habit of going around the place licking surfaces. And I know I've had you licking stainless steel earlier tonight, but it's kind of like licking a piece of slate. It's got this beautiful earthiness about it. And then this charry sort of tobacco-y characters. You get a little lick of that vanilla oak, but I just love that more savoriness to it. And it's kind of like a delicate red wine, but at the same time, quite a complex red wine. So I really love Nebbiolo. This is not a traditional, I guess, Italian style Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo is traditionally really tannic and really big, and you actually need to sit it in a bottle for about 5 years for those tannins to really settle down. But we use a French winemaking technique in this that we call post-ferment maceration. And I won't talk about that now because we actually also use it in our Cabernet. So I'll have a chat about what that technique is when we get to our Cabernet. But what it does is it creates quite soft tannins. So we still get tannin structure, but without that really hard heaviness. And we get this more, I guess, more delicate version of a traditional Italian Nebbiolo. Now, Nebbiolo is a perfect match of truffles. It goes really well with those more earthy, mushroomy flavors. I forgot about cheese matches along the way, but they should be on your tasting notes there anyway. Yeah, anything with truffles, anything that's got that nice bite to it, I find goes quite well with red wines, you know, mature cheddars, those sort of a slightly more stinky like Telaggio, those sort of soft cheeses. But Nebbiolo is a variety that is starting to become quite, I don't know, popular is the right word, but well known in Australia. You know, you could probably go into your local bottle shop and ask, do they have an Australian Nebbiolo? And the chances would be quite high that they'd say yes. So it's not a Barbera or one of these other varieties that you actually have to hunt around a bit for. We're really starting to see a lot of this being planted around Australia. You know, Adelaide Hills does some great stuff. Of course, our region does some straight stuff. Down in King Valley, there's stuff. And I'm starting to see more and more little pockets that are producing really good quality Nebbiolo. I think we're going to see more of it in those cooler regions. I just think it holds that tannin structure better when you've got the slightly cooler ferments. But Nebbiolo, I love it. Remember it for truffles. Actually, the Italians, I think it's just outside of Florence. They do this like wild boar and truffle infused salami, and that with Nebbiolo, it's like the perfect match. So next up tonight, we're going to taste our Shiraz. And, you know, I had to make a Shiraz. Shiraz has been part of my winemaking history and my winemaking journey from day one. I grew up in Canberra. Well, I actually lived on a sheep farm. You would have driven past it on the way out, just a place called Breadbow, just near Breadbow anyway. And when I finished school, wasn't sure, I kind of wanted to be either a winemaker or an outdoor education teacher. I don't know why those two, but they were the ones in my mind. And my dad said to me, you know, Jeff, you should really try and get a job in one of the local wineries over the summer period to see if you actually do enjoy it and want to become winemaking. I thought, oh, it's a pretty good idea, Dad. I'll do that. So I went and got a job at a winery in Canberra, which I'm sure you've heard of, Clonakilla. And that was back in early 2000s. And I originally was just going to do a summer with them, and I ended up spending 3 years with Clonakilla. I did most of my study through Charles Sturt by correspondence. And so, you know, Clonakilla is super famous for their cool climate Shiraz. And so Shiraz is really part of my winemaking journey. I had to make Shiraz because it's one of the reasons we're on the world wine map. It's one of the first varieties that we really became recognized for all around the world. The problem is our region, far too cold for Shiraz. We can't get it right. We're quite a cold region. People don't realize, you know, we harvest sometimes after Tasmania. So, you know, sparkling wines, Pinots, Nebbiolos, a bigger Nebbiolo, perfect for our region. Shiraz, we just can't really get it right. You know, some areas like out at the Canyon Lee, we've got all these funny little microclimates in our region, but out near Canyon Lee, they do some slightly warmer, nicer Shiraz. But for me, where our vineyard is a little bit too cold. So we work really closely with some growers in the Hilltops region. I'm sure you've heard of the Hilltops before, up near Young, and that's where we get our grapes from. And that's why it comes under our Creators series. Now, we have two series. We have our Sustainable series, which is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. And then we have our Creators series, which is not 100% off our biodynamic blocks, but it's stuff that we work very closely with the growers or have some hand in the vineyard. So that's where we get our Shiraz from. You know, Shiraz is a funny variety. It's been around for ages. You know, first it was, I guess, Barossa, McLaren, they put their stamp on it with those big, bold sort of styles. And then, you know, the younger generations came through and we created these more, I say younger, I'm 42, 43 actually. And so I'm going to hang on to the idea that I'm young for a little bit longer. And we created these more delicate ethereal styles. And I actually remember sitting with Tim Kirk from Clonakilla, and it must have been, oh God, I don't know, 2003, 2004. And you know, Halliday and all these wine writers were talking about, making these 15%, 14.5% alcoholic Shirazes. And we're sitting there tasting some wines thinking, you know, should we be trying to get our sugar levels higher so we can make those big, bold sort of styles as well? Or should we stick to something that we ended up deciding to stick to, these more delicate ethereal styles like the Rhone Valley we often see from over in France? So I tried all these different things of Shiraz. You know, I've tried old school French techniques. I've tried cutting edge Californian techniques. And one thing I find that's really interesting with Australian Shiraz is it just doesn't want to be filled with. So probably the most hands-off, easy winemaking we do is with this Shiraz, but it just works. You know, we de-stem it, we ferment it on its skins for about 3 weeks, we press it off, we put it into oak for 12 months and then into bottle. So it's really, you know, quite straightforward, easy winemaking, but because the quality of the fruit is so great, we end up with these beautiful, delicate wines. And one of the things I like most about cool climate Australian Shiraz is the structure. And when you taste it, have a think about where the acid is and where the tannin is. And what you get right down the middle of the tongue is this beautiful line of acid and tannin. And what that does is it creates structure around the wine. So if you can imagine those big sort of warm climate Shirazes, they have all this complex, intense fruit character, and they just kind of go, there you go. And they give it to you all at once. And you're like, whoa, that's amazing. But wow, all at once, that's incredible. These cool climate styles have all this complex, intense fruit flavor. But because of this beautiful structure, they kind of just hand you the flavor and hand you the flavor and hand you the flavor rather than throwing at you all at once. So that's one of the reasons I really love these cool climate styles. For me, Canberra, Hilltops and Heathcote, they're my three favorite cool climate regions in Australia. I just find, for Shiraz anyway, I just find that it's really hard to get that beautiful linear sort of backbone. Sometimes you get like a bit of a dip in the middle. And also to get that nice balance of a little bit of spice, but not too much, but then get that nice raspberry and dark chocolate still. And we see that in those areas, definitely, in that nice balance of spicy white pepper and cinnamon and raspberries and those sorts of things. That's our Shiraz, and I absolutely love that Shiraz. You know, if you are a fan of Cool Climate Shiraz, that's pretty much exactly what you'd expect to get. You know, we have, I didn't want to do anything too fancy with it because I just wanted it to represent that style of winemaking, because I think it's such a great style. So we've got one more to go, which is an interesting one to end on. We call it our post-Mac Cabernet Sauvignon. And I was really lucky when I was back at uni. I think there was about, I don't know, maybe under 10 people studying to be a winemaker at the time at Charles Sturt. And what it meant was I had I guess one of our lecturers who taught us about all our wine tasting, master of wine, Nick Bulliard. And because there was about 10 of us, he could just grab a bottle from his cellar and all of us could taste it. 2 years after me, there's about 200 people doing the same course. And so he couldn't just grab a bottle from his cellar. You know, it was a bit harder to get the numbers in, that sort of thing. So I got to try some absolutely stunning wines. And Nick Bulliard, he tells this fantastic story where he was down in Adelaide and he's walking down the street of Adelaide and he just walked past this pub. And out the front of the pub was this skip bin. And he just happened to glance in the skip bin on his way past, and there's a bottle of wine at the bottom. So he's jumped in, he's pulled it out, and he's brought it into uni. It's just a little half bottle. And we cracked it open, we all tasted it. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill vineyard is the original Penfolds vineyard before they built half of Adelaide on top of it. And so it was what would have been about a 40-year-old wine then, probably a bit older. And it was just incredible the way these funky, complex flavors of the aged wine and the fresh fruity wine came together. And it was just incredible. I mean, it reminds me a little bit. I had a flatmate at uni who was studying to be a chef. And one morning he's come out and he said, "Oh, guys, I'm making everyone French toast for breakfast." I thought, "Oh, yeah, cool. Sounds good." You know, so he's, made the toast and he's cut up these bananas and he's put the bacon on top of the bananas and a bit of maple syrup. And I'm looking at it going, bacon and maple syrup and, bananas, what the egg, what's going on here? And then I tasted it. And the way that savory and those sweet characters just worked together was just magic in my mouth. And aged, really old red wines kind of remind me of this. You get these funky, like fish sauce, composting guavas, and these really kind of funky tobacco-y characters. And then you still have some of those nice fresh fruit characters. And the way they come together is just magical. And so ever since then, I've been obsessed with wanting to make a wine that's going to age 50 to 100 years. And when you look around the world at what regions are really famous for making these beautiful, delicate reds that age for a long time. And the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And the Bordelais created this technique that we call post-ferment maceration. And what it is if you get a red grape and you squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is actually red. Sorry, is actually white. And so to make a red wine, what we actually need to do is extract all that color from the skin. So what we do is we ferment the skins with the wine, and that extracts all the color. And that ferment process, it might take 3 or 4 weeks, and then we usually press them off. If we leave those skins sitting with the wine after the ferment, it's called post-ferment maceration. And that's what we use with this wine. And the reason we do it is there's 2 problems we have when we're aging a bottle of wine. The first problem is our fruit level. So imagine I have a bottle of wine and the fruit level's here. And as I age that bottle of wine, our fruit levels are slowly dropping and our savory levels are slowly increasing. And the premium drinking is kind of somewhere in the middle here, where we've got this nice balance of savory and sweet. And, you know, that might be, say, 10, 20 years. But if we want to get to 50 to 100 years, we've got to start with a really high amount of stable savory fruit. So when it balances out up here. So that's our first problem. Our second problem is a structural problem. And you know, when you have a really young Cabernet, it has those real edgy, chalky tannins. They kind of, you know, they stick to the underside of your tongue there. They're really grippy and edgy. Well, those short, edgy tannins, they're actually a short chain tannin. And when we age a bottle of wine, those short chains join into a long chain. And a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So that's one of the good things that's happening as we age a bottle of wine. So let's imagine I have a bottle of wine, and in that bottle, I've got 100 short tannins. And I age that bottle for 10 years, and, you know, those 100 tannins, they join together to 50 long tannins, and I might age it for another 10 or 20 years, and those 50 long tannins join to 25 really long tannins. So I've got 25 of these beautiful, soft, velvety tannins in that wine. The problem is 25 is not enough, and the whole structure of that wine falls apart, and it goes through a process that we call cracking up. And cracking up is a great description for it. If you've ever tried a wine that's cracked up, you know, red wine fills the mouth with all the flavor and texture. It's almost like someone has pulled it apart, and you've got flavor and texture here, flavor and texture in here, and then right down the middle of this kind of zigzag of just acidy water. It's a really great description for it. So these two problems are solved by this technique of post-ferment maceration. And you imagine I've got a tank of wine sitting there, and in that tank, I've got all the skins and seeds and stems for a really long time. So we leave ours for 18 months. And so you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around that tank, which forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle this wine, I'm bottling it with 100 long stable tannins rather than 100 short unstable tannins. That's how this technique solves that structural problem. The fruit problem, well, I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out the first time. Because I remember the first time we tried this technique would have been back in 2015, and we made all this Cabernet and we put it in tank, and it'd be sitting on the skins there for about 3 months. And I remember coming out to the winery and taking a sample. I smelt it and I tasted it. I thought, oh my God, I have completely ruined this wine. It's absolutely disgusting. And I started calling some winemaker friends and some mentors in the industry. Guys, have you tried this technique? Tell me about it. And they all said the exact same thing. Yes, Jeff, we tried it. We got to 3 months. It tasted terrible. We pressed it off. We put it into oak. We let it mature, and then we blended it out. Don't worry, Jeff. It ends up being fine. You can blend it out. It's not as bad as you think. So everyone in Australia was telling me to press it off. A couple of my friends in France said to me, no, Jeff, trust us. You've just got to leave it. And so I decided to leave it. And I waited 12 months, and yeah, it really wasn't that much better. And then I waited 18 months, and I could taste that those tannins had become long. It was not nice and soft and velvety, but it had no fruit flavor. It was just sort of skinsy and stemsy. And so we pressed it off, and we put it into oak, and we left it in oak for 18 months. And I remember bottling this wine the first time in 2015, or 2015 vintage. So we would have bottled it in 17, I think. So I remember bottling it. I remember thinking at the time, am I doing the right thing here? Am I about to end up with pallets of wine I can't sell because it's got no fruit character at all? It's just dry and stemsy. I thought, wow, I've already started bottling. I've already got the bottles, so I may as well bottle with, I'll worry about it later. So we bottled all this wine. And it was about 18 months later, out of nowhere, there was this explosion of fruit. Unbelievable. It's really intense cassis, capsicum, tomato leaf characters in the wine. And I became really excited about this style and these techniques because it is doing what the French said it would do. For me, 2015, it was a little bit too much capsicum and a little bit too much capsicum. I wanted a little bit more cassis. And so in 2000, that's 2015, 2016, I let it ripen 2 weeks longer on the vines to try and get a bit more of that cassis flavor. When you ripen red grapes, it changes the structure of the tannins slightly. And so in 2016, the tannins were a little bit softer, and using this technique, it softened them too much. And the 2016 wine became way too soft and didn't have that structure behind it. And so we actually didn't bottle it under our Tractus label. That was bottled under our Black Sheep label. Then 2017, I ripened it 1 week more than 15, 1 week less than 16. And I think we really hit the nail on the head for this wine. We've got a little bit of that capsicum, a hint of mint, but definitely pushing into that more of that cassis sort of character. And I am super excited about these wines because they are doing exactly what the French said they would do. And, you know, who knows? Because I still to this day have not met anyone in Australia that's made a Cabernet 18 months on the skins the same as they do over there. I think Australia, the biggest I've met is about 6 months, and that was actually Wine Australia doing a whole lot of trials. And it's because they do it every month and then taste it and analyze it every month. And they got to that 3 month stage and it tasted terrible. And they thought, oh, we'll take it to 4 months, and it tasted terrible. And they took it to 5 months, it tasted terrible. And it tasted 6 months, they tasted terrible. So they stopped the project. And you really just have to wait for that 12 to 18 months for it to sort of polymerize out. So in 50 years' time, we can get back on one of these sessions and I'll tell you whether this experiment works, because who knows whether our tannins are the same as the French tannins and what's going to happen in the long term. But I am really excited about this wine. It is drinking beautifully now. You know, Cabernet, perfect match for those sweeter meats like lamb, and is drinking beautifully. But I can't wait for this to start developing that more savory, sort of soy saucy, fish saucy characters in the wine. So guys, that's all the wines I've got for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope my stories weren't too long. Please, all these wines are available downstairs. The staff here have got all the matches for all the food. So please make sure you match them with food. And, you know, if you come from Sydney or up north somewhere, please drop into the Highlands on your way home. Have a lovely evening and look after yourselves and stay safe on the slopes.